Hey everyone, my name is Francis from Fujifilm. In this video, we're going to take a look at how to set your camera if you're coming from a DSLR or another brand of cameras. So keep on watching. If you're coming from a different camera system, you might be used to a PASM dial kind of setup to change your shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. On the Fujifilm system, you will find the more traditional kind of dials for the shutter speed and the aperture ring to change your settings. So let's take a look at that and sort of clarify how it works. So as you can see on the top of the camera, we have the shutter speed dial here. We also have the aperture ring on the lens, and on certain cameras from the X series, you will find the ISO dial as well. Now, this is how you change all these settings. Now, you might wonder how you get into the P, the A, the S, the M mode on a Fujifilm camera. So if we're looking at the camera from the top, now we have the shutter speed dial here. If I have the lens set to an aperture value and I change the shutter speed dial to A, I am now in aperture priority, which means that I'm controlling the aperture. Now it's going to stay the same, and the shutter speed will adapt to give you the correct exposure. So that will be the A mode. Now, if I change it up and I put the lens to A and I change the shutter speed to a specific speed, I am now in the S mode, the shutter speed priority mode. Now, if I change it up and I put the shutter speed and the aperture ring on A, I am now in program mode, the P mode. So both the shutter speed and the aperture will be set automatically. Now, if I want to extend it more to have the camera full auto, I can also switch the ISO to A. Now, everything will be chosen by the camera, the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture. And then if I put everything to a specific setting, then I'm going to be in manual. Now, what's really nice is that if you look at the LCD or inside the EVF, you will find the representation on the screen, whether you're in P, an A, an S, or an M mode. Now, if you don't want to use the shutter speed dial and the aperture ring to change these settings, and you want to do it more like you were doing on your other system, which is using the front and rear command dial, you can also do that. The way you do that is simply that you're going to put the shutter speed dial to T, and then you're going to put the aperture ring on A. Now, for the aperture, you will need to do something first. You'll need to go into the menu and set it once so that it'll remember that. So going into the menu, you will go into the wrench icon and then to the button and dial setting. And then you are going to go down, and then you're going to go to aperture ring setting A, and you can change it from auto to command. Now, I set it to command and I come back. Now, if I'm rotating the rear command dial, you can see that my shutter speed is changing. And then if I'm rotating my front command dial right here, I'm changing the aperture value. Now, if you're used to shooting that way, it might be a little bit more comfortable for you. Now, you might be using the back button focusing technique, and this is available on the Fujifilm system as well. On certain cameras like the X-T4, we do find an AF on button on the back of the camera. But let's say you had a camera that didn't have this button, or you wanted to change the position of the AF on button on the X-T4, you could do that as well. So what you have to do is simply press on the display back button for a second. You will see the function setting menu appearing. Now you can select the button you want to use for back button focusing. So let's say we wanted to change it from the AF on and we wanted to put it on the AEL button right here. So we simply select this button and then we go and find the AF on feature in the function button list, and then we assign it to the button. And now, as you can see, if I press on the AEL button, it's going to focus. Now, you might want to decouple the shutter button from autofocusing. So how you do that is that you simply go into the menu, and then you're going to go down to the wrench icon, to button and dial setting, and then shutter AF, and then AFS, set it to off, AFC, set it to off, or you can keep one on as you wish. And now if I'm half pressing on the shutter button, it's not going to focus. It's only going to focus when I press on my AF on dedicated button. Now that we're talking about autofocus, let's talk about the different autofocusing modes and how you get to them. On most of our cameras, you will find in the front of the camera this little switch here that you can switch from manual, continuous, or single. The way you are going to move your focusing point is going to be with the AF joystick on the back of the camera or the touchscreen LCD. So let's take a look at that. So on the back of the camera, we can see we have a joystick here or an 8-way lever. And then by moving it around, we can change where we want to put our focus point. If we click on it once, we can then rotate the rear command dial to make it bigger or smaller. We can click again on the joystick to bring it back to the center. So this is in single point mode, but there's also zone and wide tracking. So if you want to change, by default, we simply press on the upper button of the D-pad and then we can switch to zone or wide tracking. Now in zone, you will see the same operation. You click on it and then you can make the zone bigger or smaller, and you can also move it around. If we go to wide tracking, we can also click on the joystick and set where we want our focus point to be. Now, if we select the last mode, which is all, by pressing on the joystick, we can actually rotate the rear command dial again and then go through all of the modes just by rotating the rear command dial. And then lastly, we can choose the amount of focusing points that are selectable on the camera. So on the latest cameras, we have the option of having 425 autofocusing points or 117. So why would you choose one another? Well, when you have 475 points, it can be a bit long to travel with the joystick from a corner to another. By having 117 points, it makes it quite faster. So we spoke about using the joystick to change the AF point around, but we can also use the touch screen. So if we look on the back of the camera on the corner, we can see we have this little tab here. So if I press on it, I can change it to shoot. So whenever I'm going to touch the screen, it's going to move the AF point around and take a shot. If we put it to AF, then it's going to move the focus point around but focus immediately. And then lastly, my favorite is the area. So it will simply move the focus point around, but it won't focus. So I can just tap or I can drag around. So now we're going to set the image quality settings. So we'll go into the camera's menu, and then first we have image size. So this is for the JPEG. So you choose the format you want, whether it's 3x2, 16:9, 1x1. I'm gonna set it to the native one, 3x2 in the maximum resolution. The image quality. Now, this is whether you want to shoot RAW only or JPEG plus RAW. So you have fine, normal. These are the JPEG modes. You have fine plus RAW, so you have a JPEG fine and a RAW file. Normal and RAW, so there'll be a JPEG with a little bit of compression or simply RAW. I personally like to shoot in the fine plus RAW setting. Next, you have the RAW recording. Now, you have a couple options. You have either uncompressed, lossless compress, which is going to be a compressed RAW file, but it will retain the full image quality. Or you do have a compressed RAW. So there you'll have some compression with some quality loss. So personally, I really like using lossless compressed. So next we get to the film simulation. These will affect the JPEG images only. Your RAW will always be a raw flat image that you can work with. The JPEGs are gonna be pretty much baked in, but also ready to go. So if you manage to get your exposure right and all your settings right, basically your images are ready to go. So let's go through film simulation. So here are all the profiles that are available from Fujifilm. So all the classic film look are integrated in the X-Series cameras. So depending on the camera you have, you might not have all of the film simulation. This is really dependent on the camera you have, but all Fujifilm cameras have film simulation built into the cameras. So it's just a matter of finding the one that fits best with your taste and the situation. For example, you have the Pro Via Standard that is pretty much true to life colors. If we go to Velvia, for example, you'll have more vivid colors, more suited for landscape and nature photography. You have Astia, that's more of a softer color, nice blue and things like that. So there are many film simulations to choose from, and really it's about you finding the ones you like. Getting back into the menu, we have the grain effect, so we can simulate some film grain. You have different roughness and size that you can choose from. You have color chrome effect that will punch the colors. It will give it more pop, as you can see in these sample images. Next, we have the color chrome effects blue that will do kind of the same thing, but really targeting the blue. So the sky, if you want to really make the sky blue and pop. We also have things like the tone curves. So if you wanted more details in both the highlights and the shadows, you would set them to -2 to get the maximum details into both the shadows and highlights. On the opposite end, if you wanted to crush the shadows or crush the highlights, then you would bring them up to 4, for example. And you can play and see with these settings what you like best, and depending on the scene as well, these will vary. But these again are only affecting the JPEG. So if you shoot both JPEGs and RAW, you know, you can play around a little bit more on the JPEGs and be on the safe side with having your RAW files as well. You also have all these other settings like color, sharpness, noise reduction. On some cameras, you have the clarity as well. These are pretty self-explanatory. So again, you can play with these settings and tune it down to what you like. Now, if we go into the shooting settings, there's a lot of options, but there's a few I want to show you. So let's get to it. So going into the menu, into the shooting setting menu, we can go into the drive setting. Now, the drive setting will allow you to configure the different position of the drive dial. So if we look here, if I put it to continuous low, continuous high, bracketing, this is where I can configure how these will behave. So in the drive setting menu, if I go to continuous high speed burst, I can choose whether my continuous high will be 10 frames per second, 15 frames per second, 20, or up to 30 frames even. Going back, the same thing is going to be for the CL, the continuous low speed burst. Do I want it to be at 3 or up to 8 frames per second? So that's where I choose it. Now going back, if I go into the bracketing setting, the first option is going to be choosing which type of bracketing I want to do. Do I want an auto exposure bracketing, ISO, film simulation, white balance, dynamic range, or focus bracketing? Let's say I set it to auto exposure bracketing. Now I can set the options for this type of shooting. So the amount of frames I want and the steps I want in between. And that will give you a nice representation as well to give you a visual of what you're going to get. If I go into the film simulation, for example, I have the 3 films I can select. So the first is standard Provia, second one is classic chrome and classic negative. I can change it to classic chrome if I want it for the third, and then let's say Eterna for the second. So when I set it to the bracketing mode and choose film simulations, these are the 3 films that are going to be saved when I take one image. Back into the shooting setting menu, I want to set my shutter type. So with Fujifilm cameras, we do have a couple of different shutter type we can use. So if we take a look at them, we have the mechanical shutter, which will be mechanical curtains opening up and closing. So that's the standard one. We have the electronic shutter, which can go up to 1/32,000 of a second. So a really fast shutter speed. We can have the electronic front curtain shutter. So the first curtain will be electronic, and then the second one will close, will be a physical shutter. The E-front curtain shutter is very useful to reduce blackout time, so it'll be very useful when doing some continuous shooting. But when shooting a shutter speed higher than 1/2000 of a second, it can introduce some artifacts, so it's best to keep it under 1/2000 of a second. We then have mechanical and electronic. This one will shoot mechanically up to 1/8000 of a second, and if it needs to go even faster, it will then switch to electronic. This is very useful if you're shooting portraits, for example, outside with a very wide aperture of, for example, the 56-1.2, and you're shooting outside and there's a lot of light, I personally shoot it that way. So if there's too much light and it needs to go higher than 1/8,000 of a second, it will switch to electronic and go up to 1/32,000 of a second. So that's really useful, and that's personally one of my favorite. The next one is E-front curtain shutter plus mechanical shutter. So when you'll be shooting under 1/2000 of a second, it'll be shooting with the electronic front curtain, but when it reaches a shutter speed higher than 1/2000 of a second, it will switch to fully mechanical. Now the last one is E-front plus mechanical plus electronic, so basically a combination of everything together. Now let's talk about screen configuration. The great thing about mirrorless camera is that you can have a live view of what you're shooting. So as you change your settings, the shutter speed and ISO and aperture, you will see in real time what your image will be. Now, if you come from a DSLR, you might be wondering, yeah, but if I shoot in a studio and the camera can't take in consideration the flashes, so everything will be dark. Well, there's a way around that. So to disable the live view, you will simply go into the menu and into the screen option, and then you will go down until you find the preview exposure white balance in manual mode. Once you click on it, you can see you have different options. So you can see the preview of the exposure and the white balance. You can see the white balance only, which means that as you shoot, the camera will constantly bring back a balanced exposure for you to see. So you won't see the real final image, but you will see the white balance. Now, if you turn it off, you won't see a preview of the white balance or the exposure. You will just see a clear vision of what you're doing, whether it's really bright or really dark. According to your camera settings, you will just see like a DSLR. Now, a good thing to do is to assign that function of switching on and off the preview to a function button by simply pressing on the display back button and then assign it to a button of your choice. So going into the function options, I can go down and then I can find the preview exposure white balance in manual mode. So when I'm going to press on that button, I'm going to be toggling between seeing a preview or not. Now let's look at how we can customize our display, both for the EVF and for the LCD on the back of the camera. So if we go into the menu, and then we go down to the wrench icon again, and to screen option, I can play with the brightness, the color, and all that, but I want to customize what items I can see on my screen. So I go down to display custom setting, and then from there you have a whole lot of options to choose from. So you could have framing guidelines, you could have your histogram, for example, you can have highlights alerts, and a lot more stuff. I personally really enjoy having my histogram on my screen as well as the horizon level, making sure that my frames and the horizon is perfectly straight. Now, in order to make the camera really yours, you can configure function buttons to settings you use often. And we spoke about it a little bit earlier when we spoke about the preview, live view, switching between the two. So how do you do that? You simply press on the display back button for a second, and then you will see a diagram that will appear. And then from there, you get a diagram showing you exactly which button will be affected. And then by selecting that button, you can choose from a lot of functions. And then that way you can have access to functions that you would be using often. And for me personally, toggling the live view exposure on and off is very useful because I do shoot often in the studio. So I like to assign it to a button. Or face detection, for example. Sometimes I want it on, but sometimes I want to focus on an object and it might be people in the back and I don't want to focus on them. So having a button that I can quickly press on to deactivate that face and eye detection is really handy. And again, on the Fujifilm cameras, you do have a lot of buttons that you can customize. So I hope this video was useful to setting up your new or your future Fujifilm camera. This was Francis Bedford from Fujifilm, and thank you for watching.